our online delegates, the hybrid event. So welcome to everyone out there on the web. Before I hand over to our first speaker, there's a few bits of information I'd like to pass on. Our next one-day event is Moving On Up, which is a careers event for mid-career museum people. That's being held at the People's History Museum later in March. I'd also like to remind everyone that the call for proposals for the MA's annual conference is open, but it closes quite soon on the 7th of March. So if you have any great ideas for the conference, which is in Newcastle Gateshead, please do submit them on the MA website, where you can also find about all our events. So, and finally, before I hand over to our first speaker, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Glasgow Life for hosting this event. As you know, this event is free for all individual members of the MA and all staff who work in institutions of MA members, and we really couldn't run these events for free without support of our institutional members such as Glasgow Life. So thanks very much. And that's a nice link to our first speaker, who is Duncan Dornan, who's the Head of Collections and Museums at Glasgow Life, and who's going to give a short welcome. So over to you, Duncan.
Thank you, Simon. It's wonderful to see you here in Glasgow today. We're delighted to welcome you. Fantastic to see such a good turnout and see people back live in meetings in 3 dimensions, and that's a huge improvement, a real change. See you have an excellent programme in store for today. We arrive here at a very interesting time for the museum sector, I think, and we all believe passionately that museums can change lives and make a huge difference. And that's why we're here, and that's why we work in this sector. As you're probably aware, Glasgow has invested really heavily in its museum service over the last 20 or 30 years. That comes from a belief that culture, and museums in particular, are an instrument both of improving individuals' lives, but also economic regeneration and redefining and remaking a city in the world's eyes. And Glasgow is an example of how that's been really successful. So Glasgow's has 3 major museum refurbishments. It's generated enormous footfall, enormous international interest. It's generated substantial economic regeneration for this city, and it's also been very effective in providing a cultural outlet and provision for some of the most disadvantaged people in Glasgow. And I can put some numbers around that. So though Glasgow still has significant economic problems and significant social problems, at the same time, half of the city's population are disproportionately well educated, and they're in highly paid jobs. 12% of Glasgow's population is university students, and that's very significant. Those people love the quality of life in Glasgow, and they create new businesses to allow them to stay in Glasgow and continue to have that lifestyle. And that's driven by Glasgow's investment in cultural provision. Equally, for those people in our society who are disadvantaged, around pre-pandemic, around 1.5 million visits a year to Glasgow museums were by Glaswegians. Roughly half of the city's population visit and half don't. So that means that 300,000 people in Glasgow made 1.5 million visits a year to museums and galleries, 5 times each on average. Of that half of the population, 38% were in SIM D1, the most disadvantaged people in our society. So attending museums is a cultural activity for the most disadvantaged people in society, giving them a focus, giving a break from their ordinary lives, give them an opportunity to engage and interact, and give them reasons to be out of the house. And that's a hugely important thing that we do. We are enormously challenged. We're only too well aware that we're entering yet another period of apparently endless austerity, with further financial pressure on museums. And I would suggest, I think most of you would, we're at a point where the impact of that is going to be felt and is actually going to be quite severe. Nonetheless, we know that our services change lives and make a huge difference, and we need to do the best we can to maintain provision and to continue to support both our communities and to support the economic regeneration and prosperity of our towns and cities. We've got a fantastic programme ahead of you today. You don't want to listen to me, you want to get started with that. So with that, I'll just finish. Thank you for joining us in Glasgow, for joining us in the recital room, which incredibly, up until the last refurbishment of the City Halls, had been mislaid and was discovered in the last refurbishment. So it's a privilege to be here. 30 years ago, this would have been a complete mystery. Welcome to Glasgow. It'll be a fantastic afternoon. It's a great programme, I'm sure you will. And now pass over for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Duncan, for that introduction. Yeah, it is a lovely room and we're really glad to be here. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first session. That's going to be an in-conversation session led by Gillian, who's the MA President and works for Edinburgh Museums. She'll be joined by Michael Turwey, who's an MA board member and works for the National Trust for Scotland. We also have Laura Faulkner-Rogers, who is an MA rep and works for National Museums Scotland, and Shanila Shafiq, who's a gallery assistant at Glasgow Museums and is also an MA rep. So welcome all of you and come up and start.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, Duncan, for that very warm welcome. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be in Glasgow and to be part of the amazing events and programme at Glasgow Life. So it's wonderful to be here today and to see, as Simon said, so many fellow members in person. It's superb. Simon has already introduced my colleagues. We're going to have about 20 minutes for hopefully quite informal but interesting discussion session. And I think before we kick off, it might be useful if we just say a little bit about what we do on a day-to-day basis. We know where we work now, but if you can just say a little bit about what you do and your relationship with the MA, I think that would be hopefully quite useful. So can I pass to you, Shanila?
So my name is Shanila and I work at the Burrell Collection with Glasgow Museums, and I'm a gallery assistant. So I'm front of house staff, and I've been appointed MA Scotland representative, and I'm very honoured to represent both Scotland and Glasgow Museums here. Thank you.
Can I just say I'm really excited that you're our newest rep. I was really rooting for you. I'm Laura. I use she, her pronouns. I work as a visitor experience assistant at National Museums Scotland, where I've worked for 4 years now. My very first introduction to the MA was the Scotland members event because it was free. So I always have a special place in my heart for this particular event. At work, I also am a branch secretary and equalities rep for the PCS union.
I'm Michael Turwey from the National Trust for Scotland. I'm Director of Public Engagement and Research, which is a whole range of different activities to do with connecting people with heritage and the value of the places that we care for.
Thank you all. Thank you. So today we're going to be discussing a topic which is all too familiar, I know, to everybody in this room and to the organisations we work for and with. We're going to be talking about the cost of living crisis and specifically thinking about how that's affecting museums and also how museums are responding to the various complex issues that this topic raises. We're hopefully going to be referencing some real life examples, but I'm looking around the room at the amazing breadth of museums that are represented today, and I'm hoping that some of you will also feel compelled to contribute your experiences and tell us more generally about your initiatives in your place of work, or how your colleagues, your audiences, your museums are affected by cost of living. So we'll be sure to leave a little bit of time at the end of our discussion. And I really hope some of you will be thinking now about experiences that you'd like to share. To kick us off, I should probably just remind us of the context if it's needed, just very briefly. I think around about 18 months ago, most of us were thinking about the future. We were in a state, if you remember, where the pandemic was becoming more of an endemic status. We were thinking, I think, most of us, about recovery and about welcoming audiences back, about rebuilding and reconfiguring what we do in a more focused way. None of us, I think, could have predicted this, what's befallen us since, a war in Europe, a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, and the many impacts that has had. The MA acted very quickly to release a statement highlighting the many ways that museums were being hit by this crisis, and those who worked in them were being impacted, and calling for long-term investment to support our sector to become more energy efficient and to create more sustainable business models. And I have to add, I think it's great to see our advocacy, along with other sector partners, has paid off, not least in the extension of the price cap time frame, which was 6 months initially and has now been extended to include museums, which is great news. So today we're going to look at some of the specific issues to museums and museum staff and museum operations, and think about the role and expectations of museums in supporting their communities, local families and local residents to get through what has been a difficult 6 months and is likely to be difficult for some time to come. So if I can set ourselves a question, panel colleagues, perhaps you can kick off by telling us how some of your museums are supporting visitors and communities through the cost of living crisis. What's happened over the winter? What have you got planned? Shanila, do you want to start off?
So there are many ways we can look at the cost of living crisis. We can look at it from the museum's management point of view, from the visitors' point of view, from the staff point of view. So our museum at the Borough Collection, we have really stepped up our game with the sense that we have lots of energy efficient measures in place to deal with the cost of the energy crisis. We have lots of, we also have a shuttle bus. Parking is a huge issue for people, especially with rural museums. So in our museum, we have the free shuttle bus that people can access. We have lots of activities by the Learning and Access team for adults and for children, so they can access the museums for free. The Glasgow museums, we are very fortunate that there's no tickets, so it's free for all at the point of entry. And we have an amazing temporary exhibition on at the moment, a special exhibition, and that's also free. So there's no tickets for that. So we have tons of things. I have lots of lists I can go on and on, but I would let other people share what they're doing too with their museums.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm similar to you in that I'm lucky to work in a museum that's free entry. So the really wonderful thing about that is seeing people come in again and again and not having to figure out the cost of the visit, especially when it comes to families. Something that I particularly enjoyed this week was that Edinburgh schools were closed because the teachers were on strike, and there were children dragging their grandparents into the museum and saying, I'm going to go to this gallery first and then this gallery, because they'd already been there so often that even a huge museum like NMS, they still knew where everything was that they wanted to go and see. So it really allows that kind of repeat visit as opposed to being a one-off. We've also really expanded our digital schools offer since the pandemic, and that's been fantastic because it allows more geographical reach. Something that school visits find particularly difficult is cost of transport. So even schools within Edinburgh previously could have been cut off just by physically not being able to pay to get there. So being able to do a digital offering with schools is really important, as well as the in-person visits that we can do. So expanding our family offer has been really great.
So of course, the National Trust for Scotland isn't a free museum, and we don't receive government subsidy for what we do. So there's part of the cost of living crisis is a kind of cost of operation crisis for us as an organisation, but it's really complicated because it comes on the heels of the kind of COVID crisis and and the disruption to international travel, which is that kind of core. So this is kind of affecting us in a number of different kind of overlapping ways. And to be honest, one of the biggest consequences for us is uncertainty going into the season, because we simply don't know what income is going to look like, and we don't really know whether the return of international kind of travel is going to offset any decline in spend from domestic kind of visitors. So the kind of the operating environment is incredibly challenging. We're also conscious of our staff as well. So one of the things that the Trust has done immediately at the end of last year is we brought forward our annual pay increase as well. So we were able to give all members of staff a 2% pay increase in their December paychecks, in advance of kind of further negotiations with our unions coming this year, because we recognise that our staff were suffering as a result of that. We were in a position to be able to do that then. We don't really know what it's going to look like into the future either. So yeah, we're in a slightly different situation from others, but I think it's kind of everyone's operations are kind of looking at increases in costs, which is going to be difficult to navigate.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping we can come back to that, Michael, and just look in a bit more detail at some of the operational costs, particularly around energy efficiency and making sure we can afford to open the doors and keep buildings running, but also thinking about staff well-being and the impact on our workforce of cost of living problems. And before we do, though, I just wanted to contribute a little bit from Edinburgh Museum's experience. I'm very conscious sitting in Glasgow, where there was a much larger warm and welcoming initiative here by the local authority and its partners, that we had something similar in Edinburgh. We have something similar in Edinburgh. And I think one of the positive parts of the legacy, if I can put it like that, is that there's going to be much more emphasis on some of the learning that we've garnered, working in a much more integrated way in the local authority to deliver this initiative, which has involved museums led by libraries. Well, I'll come back to that as well. Taking in community centres, education partners, and a huge number of our third sector partners who already have community building and social wellbeing at as their core objectives. So we've worked in a very integrated way. We've created accessible resources, focusing not on buildings, not actually on warm and welcoming spaces, but on, as my colleagues have said, similarly, activities, things to get people out of the house, into a space where there are facilities that they can use, they can enjoy together, trying to focus on the positive outcomes that brings rather than the reason for them to have to access that. It hasn't been, it's been very obvious to some people that there's a certain irony, however, because although this initiative has worked really well, not least in proving to quite a fragmented local authority that its departments can work together very efficiently when there's the need and the will. But also it's highlighted a number of the issues around our crumbling infrastructure. Back in December, we had to shut 2 of our warm and welcoming spaces because the boilers failed and they were literally freezing. So, you know, there have been pros and cons to the approach, but it's certainly highlighted how important those spaces are. And I think that the place of local authorities, ALIOs and publicly funded organisations to provide resources like that, particularly in times of need, but also the importance of knowing your local community, knowing what they want and making sure they know where to go to access the resources that are theirs. So lots of learning for that from us. And there is going to be a symposium in March, end of March, in Edinburgh, bringing together all of the partners to really look and unpack some of the learning and really think about what we can take forward, because there has been a lot of good work and good partnerships that have been built through the Warm and Welcoming initiative. I did want to just touch on partnerships as well and just check in with all of you. As I've mentioned, it's something that we've really found beneficial. This necessity to work in partnership through cost of living has enabled us either to build relationships that we already had or to create new ones with other providers and partners. Are there any partnerships or resources that any of you are aware of that your museums have developed or found and are using as a result of your experiences?
Well, we already work very closely. We're part of Glasgow Life. So we have the warm and welcoming spaces with the community centres and not in museums, not at the borough, but in the libraries and everything else. So we're part of a much bigger system where we have these facilities and partnerships in place. And also at the borough, we work very closely in partnership with the local schools, where we introduce them to museums and encourage them to take part in activities and have sessions. So I think at the Borough Collection, we have very close partnerships that our keeper of the borough can perhaps elaborate on many spheres, but from a front of house point of view, I've seen lots of activities and initiatives and things happen, which are very welcome.
Yeah, I would say that the front of house team, we've kind of developed closer relationships with the National Library and the National Galleries. You get so many people asking questions that it's not specifically for us, but you know that you can direct them to the libraries, even people asking for help with job applications, and you know that you can direct them to the local library and they'll get digital help from there. And that's been a really informal partnership. That's just something that's kind of grown very organically, because we ultimately just want to help the people that come to us, and increasing those partnerships is a way to do that better.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, that trend towards partnership working is something that is a trend that predates the kind of cost of living crisis. And I think one of the kind of interesting things is kind of disentangling what is short-term economic shock to the system, which is making everyone a lot poorer in the short term. But a lot of this stuff is also long-term trends, and so you've got continual kind of crisis and you're responding to immediate kind of things. It's quite difficult to kind of say, well, actually in the long term, you know, public funding has been declining for a very long time in relation to museums. Economic growth has been declining for a very long time. The climate crisis has been around for a long time as well. These are things that actually have been asking museums to work differently for a long time. So I think there's something about thinking about the immediate response that what we can do, but also thinking, what does that mean for the long-term positioning of our institutions, which kind of in some ways might not be anything that we've not already been doing, but it might bring a slightly different kind of urgency to it, where it's kind of the people who are in immediate need are our visitors or our kind of users, and it has immediate implications for kind of service provision. But certainly from a trust perspective, that trend towards us working with other people in different locations in order to achieve particular kind of things is something that has been growing for a long time and will continue to do. But the picture is quite different in different parts of the country, depending on kind of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And depending on, naturally, as we've highlighted the kind of organization that you're working for or with. I know in our department, museums now sit within culture and wellbeing. Libraries are part of that in Edinburgh, and we're working much more closely with libraries colleagues on a strategic level than we have before. But it's become really clear how well and how comfortably libraries inhabit this space of warm and welcoming. They've done it forever, and their neighbourhoods and community branches are well known, well used, and they already have a relationship with local audiences that I think, despite many initiatives, many years of trying to be more inclusive, museums still aren't the natural go-to partner for this kind of work. And I think there's something there for all of us, certainly for the Museums Association. We're talking about why that's still the case, why we're still, even those with free admission, why we're still not the natural go-to warm space in a community. I wanted to just highlight one resource, just thinking with a practical hat on for a minute, that a colleague pointed out to me a few months ago, which I think is really, really useful if anyone here is thinking about how to make their spaces more welcoming and more attractive particularly to families looking for spaces to be. The Kids and Museums website has a resource on it, which is about attracting families to your spaces during the cost of living crisis. And it's full of tips, which will be very familiar to some practitioners here, but maybe not to others. And I would recommend having a look at it. It's incredibly accessible, very easy to use, and it's free to download. So do have a look at that if you can. I'm conscious that we don't have an awful lot of time, Simon, but I'm hoping we can have a little chat really about perhaps the most important element of all of this, which is the people within museums as part of the larger community, the staff. And I wonder if, from your own experiences, you can give us some examples of how museums are supporting workforce through cost of living. Well, I start at the other end of the table, Michael. You've mentioned the pay award, which cannot be underestimated, but
yeah, and that's kind of I suppose a part of a package of things that the trust is doing to kind of and again, this is kind of part of this is self-interest. I know there are staff from the National Trust of Scotland in the room today as well. Some of this is self-interest because we've really struggled to find staff to a kind of point to our places, and that's really affected our ability to operate. And if we can't operate, then we can't generate income, and so the whole thing is a negative kind of cycle. So we're probably in that phase as an organization anyway, where we're kind of recentering ourselves around valuing our staff in a slightly different way than we were doing certainly before the pandemic. But again, I just reiterate, this is kind of comes out of the pandemic as well, and it comes out of a set of kind of working practice changes that happened around that time too, which left staff very isolated, feeling very insecure. So I can, to reiterate, I think we can't think of the cost of living crisis in isolation of all these other things. And if you want to make an impact, you also need to kind of think a little bit about how these trends are happening and pulling together. But the biggest thing we can do is pay our staff more, listen to them, and make sure their working environments are as stress-free as possible.
I can't disagree with that, being one of the people in pay negotiations. I think that one of the things that well, certainly some of us learned how to do because of the pandemic was to work slightly more flexibly and think more about individual circumstances rather than just a blanket, this is what our staff do. Hybrid working is a fantastic example of that. We're potentially now going to be in a situation where some of the staff who had decided that they preferred working from home would rather come back into the office and the museum buildings because of the energy crisis, and because if they're working from home, you know, it's a lot more expensive for them to be heating their homes. So I think it's just another example of if you can be a little bit more flexible with your staff and check in with them more. Certainly from a union perspective, we've been flagging up the hardship fund, the benevolent fund. So, you know, my annual plug, join your union, guys. But that's something that we have been doing more and more often. And I've noticed that whilst it's always going to be a real strain on line managers, you know, managing people's stress, people in financial difficulties, if you can be checking in with your staff in even a slightly more informal sense rather than just your annual PDRs and things like that, you can maybe help out in smaller ways instead of just things building up and your staff feeling isolated and, you know, and worried about how they're going to pay their bills.
I think there are many ways where staff are affected with the cost of living crisis. So because of the financial crisis, and it could lead to sickness and then affects how many staff and bodies we have on the floor, which can have a direct impact on how you deliver the service. But we are very fortunate at the borough. We have great leadership and incredibly caring and very well aware of staff issues, and they check in on us regularly. And I think great leadership can help in difficult circumstances when you are going through a lot of issues and stuff. And if you have a dignified leader who is willing to listen and understand, it can make lots of things easier. So here at the borough, our leadership, our keeper of the borough we have a guaranteed soup and sandwich scheme for food to help if people wanted to buy food from the cafe. We have lots of other things in place, regular check-in things monthly, where informally, and also not just the formal things that, you know, the paperwork that's done. But another thing I really admire is that he comes around and does his regular walk arounds and in the galleries and checks up on you to make sure you're okay, if you have anything to say. So before even any issues flag up, it's a really nice atmosphere, comfortable atmosphere. So I think we're very fortunate. Of course, they have limitations as management, what they cannot help with. There are things out with their control, but we have lots of little things in place which I think helps as. So I think I can't complain, but there are things out with their control, which I think I would like highlighted in the future. But I'm very grateful for the support I've had so far. So
it's really interesting you talking about that, Shanila. I remember during the COVID lockdown, the MA had a series of coronavirus conversations, and there was a session about leadership. And I remember we spoke at length about empathetic leadership in that situation and how important it had been, as everyone had to make this very sudden adjustment to lockdown and being at home and trying to work from home, to have a leader or management that that was empathetic and that understood and that was compassionate in making arrangements work for people recognizing individual circumstances. So
Ours is more than empathetic. I would say is inspiring. So it helps. So
I hope he's listening. So that's lovely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think what I've taken from that is that it's really important to talk about it. It's really important to care about your staff. And I'm looking at my colleague Tamsin on the front row, and I couldn't finish the session today without mentioning the MA's Wellbeing campaign, which has launched wonderful research that's been done. So thank you to everybody here who took part in the Wellbeing survey and who has provided really, really rich data for the MA to shape this campaign, which will hopefully help us support your colleagues going forward through the next months and years. Do have a look at those resources online. They're very rich and there's lots there, and it's useful for managers as well as for staff and volunteers, everybody involved in museums. Simon, I'm looking at you for time. Yeah, sorry, I was hoping we could touch on buildings, but I'm sure we can come back to that another time. Thank you to all my colleagues for this discussion. I really appreciate all your input, and thank you everybody here. I haven't left opportunity for you to feed in. I'm so sorry, but please do get in touch with your reps or with the MA staff team with examples of how you and your museums are responding to cost of living. All the evidence that you can provide helps us support you. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much to all the speakers for that first session. Cost of living is obviously something that's high in the minds of all of us professionally and personally, and this issue that doesn't seem like it's going to go away, unfortunately, and it'll play a big part in the forthcoming MA conference as well in Newcastle Gateshead. So there'll be lots of sessions related to that. So next up, we have a session chaired by the MA Director, Sharon Hill. Sharon's going to be joined by Zandra, Nelson and Sheila. I think they'll introduce themselves. So if I could welcome all speakers to the stage for this next session, we're just going to look at some key issues such as anti-racism, decolonisation and sustainability and wellbeing as well. And we'll also have a session later when Tams is going to cover our wellbeing work that Gillian mentioned earlier. So over to you, Sharon.
Thanks, Simon. Do you know what I really wanted to do at the beginning of this? All right, you can sit down, Sandra, don't panic. What I really wanted to do at the beginning of this session was actually suggest that we all get from behind the table and a bit closer to the audience. And then I thought, oh God, no, the people who are doing the tech support and streaming this will kill me because then we won't have the mics on. So apologies, because I feel like we feel quite far away from you. But do please be thinking of questions and points that you might want to make in this session. We're looking at some of the big issues that we face in society and that we know museums can help us come to terms with, challenge and explore. Sure, thanks, Lucy. So it's good to follow on from that session on the cost of living crisis and the impacts of it on museums as institutions, on staff, and also for our communities. So thank you to our reps who do an amazing job, and also our board members. Without our reps and our trustees and our members, we can do half of what we want to do in terms of making a difference in the sector and supporting museums to make a difference. So we've been challenged in this session to look at the big issues in anti-racism, sustainability, decolonisation, and we might also touch on well-being and what dealing with those big issues means in terms of well-being. And we're going to hear a little bit about how museums are tackling those topics, what best practice looks like, and what the future might hold in those areas. And as the Museums Association, we're committed to those campaigns and to making a difference. And we're going to hear from our two policy and campaigns officers in the next session around climate justice. They're new to the Museums Association. It's going to be fabulous to hear from them. But we want to drill down into some of the issues with this panel as well. At the conference in Edinburgh last year, which I know some of you will have been at, The main themes of that conference were anti-racism, decolonisation, and climate justice and sustainability. And we had those sessions as keynotes, as panels, as workshops, and those topics really flowed through the whole of the conference. But we also had to talk about the challenges of the cost of living and being more than just institutions that keep the doors open. Certainly some people have reflected that those might be nice to have topics, nice to discuss issues. But I think they're the bread and butter of what we should be doing. So without any further preamble, I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves and just say a little bit about what you do in your day job. And then we're going to dive into some questions, but please, I do want some audience questions. So be thinking of what you would like to ask the panel. So if I can go from my left to the end of the table.
The only thing I was just going to ask is if we can do visual descriptions as well, because I thought that was really great at the Museums Association conference.
Oh yeah, sure. I am a white woman with a short, I've recently had my hair cut, a short blondish bob.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Nelson Cummins. I am the Communities and Campaigns Officer at the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. We're an anti-racist charity based here in Glasgow. We do a lot of work around research, policy work and campaigning work. And in particular, I'm responsible for our work on Black history. And for those of you who aren't aware, we do a lot of work around Black history, particularly around Black History Month in Scotland and work on ensuring that Black history is recognised as being a key and essential part of Scottish history. And also in terms of description, I'm mixed race person wearing a green t-shirt. So I had to check, t-shirt's new, so get used to it.
Thanks, Nelson. Yeah, I can never remember what I'm wearing. Hi, I'm Sheila Asante, and my pronouns are she, her. And as a visual description, I'm wearing a black, can't think of the blazer is the word, and a purple t-shirt, and a mixed race woman with afro hair tied back. And I work with Museums Gallery Scotland, and just in case you're aware, they're the development and policy body for the around 430 museums across Scotland. And my role previously was working on the Empire Slavery in Scotland's Museums project, and managing the steering group who made the recommendations, and Sandra was on our steering group, and the recommendations to the Scottish Government on the legacies of historic slavery, colonialism and empire, and how to address those within Scotland's museums. And then from that, I've moved to work on a project that's looking to deliver on recommendations 2, 3 and 4 around embedding anti-racism across Scotland's museums, also around co-production and cultural participation, and then looking also at the collections and the stories that are being told. So that's the project I'm currently working on, called Delivering Change, and it's looking across the board at inclusion, but particularly kind of delivering on those recommendations as well. And I feel like that's it. Yeah, that's it.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Zandra Yeaman, and my description is I'm a mixed race person with silver hair, not grey, and I'm wearing a black top with some gold on the front. I'm the creator of Discomfort at the Hunterian at the University of Glasgow. What is my day job, Sharon? I think I'm the professional provocateur, agitator, and whatever else I'm asked to do. And I also wanted to just mention, we're in the City Halls, and this is a space where the amazing freedom fighter Frederick de Glass spoke in 1848, talking about the Free Church giving the money back. Every day is a school day.
Thank you for setting some historical context there, Sandra. So my first question, and maybe this just seems like a really obvious one that everybody knows the answer to already, but you have to remember the Museums Association is UK-wide. We don't all operate in a Scottish context, so we've heard some of the amazing work that's been done in Scotland so far. But why should museums be tackling those big societal issues such as anti-racism? Why? Why is that the museum space?
I can go again.
Nelson?
Yeah. I think for me, and I think particularly, from our perspective at CRER, because a lot of time we get that question of why we do a lot of work within the museum sector, why we see it as important to anti-racism. I think it's because museums play such a key role or can play such a key role in education, and play a key role in education, particularly on things like how legacies of slavery and empire impact the present day society. I think we look at it from that perspective in particular, the key role that museums can play in education, but also the key, cultural and social impact that museums can have in communities. In the panel just before this one, there was that conversation about museums potentially being those like community spaces, those cultural hubs. And even though I think there's still a bit of work to do in establishing that, I think it's clear that museums can play a sort of key cultural and social role, not only in education, but as a sort of space and community spaces. So to me, that's why they have to be and should be tackling big societal issues, because of the social and cultural impact they have. Like a lot of this work is about the impact spaces have on people, and museums clearly have a big impact on people and can have an even bigger impact on people if they, start to prioritize more tackling those big societal issues.
Thanks, Nelson. Sheila?
Yeah, I think it also, I totally 100% agree with what Nelson says. And I think it's also thinking about acknowledging the fact that museums already do play that role, and especially in the stories and the narratives that they've told since their inception have been grounded in people's stories and which people have been championed, or their stories have been included and those that have been excluded, and particularly looking at some of the the stories that look at perpetuating the racist stereotypes and narratives. So acknowledging that it's not something that they're doing now, but it's something that they've always done, but it's looking at where they've done it and where we can now start to unpick that and unlearn some of those narratives, and how we can actually start to tell those stories from a variety of perspectives and kind of give back to the people who have been excluded from those spaces, I think.
Well, it's clear we're all going to agree, isn't it, actually, which is, it's not question time, even though it feels like we're sitting in question time, it's not. So obviously I agree with my colleagues here, and I think what was really interesting was listening to what Duncan said about the numbers of audiences that go through the doors of a museum. And if you think about museums historically, they're always seen as institutions that preserve and present the culture and heritage of humanity. So when we think about that and we think about the numbers that go through the door and how we have the opportunity and the power and the responsibility to think about the stories we tell, to think about the systematic oppression that racism fosters, and how we can use objects, collections, environments to tell stories that eradicate biases, that eradicate this whiteness, this white ideology we have around the stories and the histories of empire, colonialism, slavery and migration. And I think they're spaces that can help to promote understanding, challenge biases, provide accurate information, create safe spaces, and inspire action. And they can contribute through using an anti-racist lens, they can contribute to a more inclusive and equitable society. And I really believe that.
And I agree with you. So we've got a panel that's completely in agreement, but we know that the sector's not 100% in agreement and on that journey. So I described what the themes were for our conference in Edinburgh last year, and a museum director said to me, that's all well and good, Sharon. We can deal with those intellectual side issues once we resolve the cost of living crisis for our institutions. So how do we win that argument about how we use our spaces in different ways? What's the kind of persuading arguments that we use? Or is it right that we've got to get the doors open first and then we can do all that stuff?
I don't think they're separate. If you think about systematic racism, who are the people who are most impacted by that structure? And it is people who are suffering the most for the cost of living crisis. So you can't separate them out as far as I'm concerned. And the other thing is this is not an add-on. That for me is one of the big issues that we have in the museum sector, and not only in the museum sector, to be fair, but that's who we're talking about today. This work is not an add-on. This is work that is integral. When we think about the audiences in our cities or spaces, wherever we are, we are talking about diverse audiences, and I'm not only talking about racially diverse, I'm talking diverse in its true sense of the word. So racism impacts on all of us. So it's not an add-on. To me, it's integral to that work. So that's how I would get them to buy into it.
Did either of you have any?
It's just mainly on the cost of living crisis. A lot of our work at CRER is focused on researching, how inequalities exist in society. And, we consistently found that in Scotland, people from a Black and minority ethnic background are about twice as likely to live in poverty as someone who's from a white Scottish or a white British background. So, the cost of living crisis, even though it's something that impacts us all and impacts us all in different ways, it's actually having a disproportionate impact on people who are Black and from a minority ethnic background. So as Sandra said, that can't be separated from race based on that statistic alone.
And yeah, and I would also, as again, agree, but I would also say from the panel before around creating those spaces that are, welcoming and warm, and, people wanted to come into that maybe libraries potentially have a bit of a head start on, thinking about, well, how, if you want to create those spaces, then you need to be able to address why people might not be coming in, why they maybe don't feel that space is welcoming and warm. So addressing those connections that you maybe there's missing there, you have to address those reasons and what are those gaps and what is those barriers. And within those variety of barriers is around the structural racism, and so it's something that has to be addressed. And also, one of the things is I think there's always, and the structures create and systems create this, there will always be something. There'll always be a reason not to do the work.
And we, just to pick up on that, we all know as well, I mean, it's a legal requirement. This is the other thing that I really don't understand. I have a human rights equalities background, and this work is not, this is a legal requirement. So there's actually, you can't say we can't do it, it's the law. But I would like to think that we want to go beyond what the legal requirement is. Obviously, that's what I'd say we're all advocates of. We know what the law is, but we also want to do a bit more than that. So there's no excuse.
And I really get that. I suppose I'm interested because Joshua and I had this conversation just the other day, and Joshua's new to the museum sector. You'll hear from him in a little while. And he was saying, but what does an anti-racist museum look like? Give me an example of a museum that is actively campaigning against racism, and what does that mean with their communities? And I've struggled, and I've been in the sector a long time, and it's the kind of practice that I want to see and I admire. So what does it look like? What's the tangible kind of example evidence of it?
I mean, I think for me, it's around, and to use human rights terms, it's around that progressive realization. So we're not going to be at that space, and we shouldn't expect people to be at that space. But what an anti-racist organization is working towards that space and continually challenging themselves to work towards that space and being aware of where they can start challenging themselves and do that work. So I don't think there's no perfect space, there never will be, but I think it's not trying to constantly say, well, you have to get to that amazing space, but actually the place that is asking those questions, those difficult questions on a regular basis and challenging themselves, that is the anti-racist space.
I would build on that as well. And what you were describing, the discussion that you're having within the sector where people are saying, oh, we've got to deal with this now, we'll deal with that stuff later. That's what non-racist looks like. Anti-racist is actually doing something about it. It's that simple. It's not about an exhibition or a plaque or a text or whatever. It's about recognising that conversation is what non-racist looks like, and anti-racism is about taking action and ensuring that is across all parts of your institution. And it's not an end to itself either. We've all worked together, so we know, it's an ongoing process. It's something that it's not a beginning, a middle and an end. It's an ongoing process.
That's really clarified things for me. Can I see if there are any questions for the panel from the audience? I've got some more stacked up, but I'm really keen to hear from people in the audience. I don't know if we've got a mic. This is an opportunity for you to ask a really fantastic panel any questions that you might have. Lucy, at the front.
I think your comments are really interesting and insightful, and but I think what do you think is specifically different about the challenge in Scotland? Because I think a lot of your really important statements you've made could be applied across the UK, but obviously we are here, we're working in the Scottish context. So what do you feel are the particular things about this that are more challenging, or that Scottish institutions are struggling with more or need to address more?
That's a great question. Are there any other questions? We could take a couple at once if there are any more. I'll come back to you if there's time, but it'd be good to get the questions in now. Yes, one towards the back there.
You mentioned earlier on the equalities with not just with those different racial backgrounds and diversity, but what do you say, just your thoughts on those that are not living in the Central Belt, those that are living in rural areas, those that live in the Highlands and Islands, do they not also deserve being educated in some way or form when it comes to museums, feeling that community spirit within their own museums also?
Brilliant. There's a really good link and synergy between those two questions. So who wants to go first on that? The Scottish context, but also the non-Central Belt context.
So I'm going to answer both questions at the same time, if that's okay. All my work on anti-racism and human rights is based in Scotland, because Scotland is where I grew up. It's what I know, it's what my experience of racism as a mixed race person born in the 60s to now is. And it's also my experience of the demographics and the policy and, how we function as a nation. First of all, in answer to your question about the context in Scotland, we have campaigned for over 20 years to get Scotland to actually acknowledge that it had direct links to empire, colonialism, slavery, migration. So that was a real barrier, because they like to think it was the big bad English that did it. And Scotland, it wasn't us, quite literally, is one of the issues that Scotland liked to distance itself from. And to the other person who asked the question, Scotland likes to think it was colonised, and there was pockets of Scotland that were colonised. When we think about the Highlands as an example, there was pockets in the Highlands that were colonised. But what is interesting is you're colonised and then you go and become a coloniser, and these are all part of these stories that we should be sharing. And museums, again, are a great space for us to enable us to do that. So this work isn't just about the Central Belt, that's the point. And I think a museum is a great conduit to make sure that this work is broader than that. The sad thing about Scotland is the sad thing for people of colour in Scotland is Scotland's a very rural country, and there has always been people of colour in Orkney, Shetland, and other parts of Scotland outside the Central Belt, such as Glasgow and Edinburgh. And it's often been ignored, but history is a great place for you to find out. As far back as the 1700s, people of colour being in places like Orkney. History is a great, for me anyway, I use history to be able to tell stories about racial equality, about racism, about emancipation, freedom, all of these things that have been going on for centuries in this country. And I think museums are a great place for us to enable us to do that across the nation. Does that answer that? I was very long-winded.
That's a really good answer, but I'm also interested, Sheila, from a Museums Gallery Scotland perspective, because you do work at a nationwide level, what you see the challenges and the context and the issues to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we were saying, that those questions are very good, well connected, because I think one of the challenges is, as the second questioner mentioned, is that rural context, and we found, particularly doing the consultation within the museum sector for Empire, Slavery in Scotland's museums, that there was, from places that were more rural, that often the question was, we don't have a population for this to be relevant. And so that argument and that kind of idea is kind of perpetuated within the spaces as well. Those people don't exist within those spaces, and so I think it's really important to challenge that understanding and to look at those stories, be aware of the variety of connections, but also to understand that it's not just about telling those stories for the Black and brown people, but it's for telling those stories for everyone, so that we understand Scotland's place globally and those connections that are made. So it is something that we have to challenge a lot whenever we're looking at how we kind of say, well, how do you broaden and how do you look at who your visitor numbers are or their visitors are, and look at those stories that you're telling. But then it's like, well, we don't have those people, but everywhere has been diverse for centuries. So it's not actually true. It's just a perception. So actually what you're doing is starting to open that up and challenge and get those conversations going about that perception so that perception doesn't continue.
I don't know if I'd add any more. I feel like, yeah, completely agree with Andrew and Sheila. I guess the only thing I'd maybe add is, I think that, and this is with the caveat of what Sandra said, that I think there's still a struggle to make sure that we properly recognise how histories of slavery and empire impact Scotland. But I think with sort of culture being devolved in Scotland, I think it definitely, with the sort of current SNP government, it's definitely made it easier to have some of those conversations. I know outside of Scotland, particularly with the current Westminster government, who I won't spend too much time slacking off, there's definitely a lot more hostility towards having those conversations. So I think even though it's not necessarily perfect, I think we're definitely in a space where you can perhaps get a bit further and you can at least have the argument heard. I think with the question on sort of rural space in Scotland as well, I think that's where it's really important, and particularly in a sector like the museum sector that has so many, large organisations, institutions, so many, very small institutions. I think that's where it's really important that there are events like this one, events like the conferences, events put on by, sort of Museums Association, Museums Galleries Scotland, that have these conversations so people know these conversations are starting to happen. It's a sector where there is space to have those conversations, but also to receive support in doing that work. Even though I know there can be barriers to it in big organisations, I think it's important to recognise that for smaller institutions, it can be very hard when you have one member of staff and you're having to take on something as complex as anti-racism. So I think that's why these sort of bigger conversations, knowing there's a wider space where it's being valued, is really important as well.
I think just to add to that, sorry, and this has always been an issue around equalities, as they've always said, across all protected character, but we don't have folk like that, or we, it's the waiting when actually it's the preparation. And one of the things we've been having conversations about is, we don't have any Black staff in our organisation, at a particular level. So we need to start preparing for that. So it's not like, let's wait till someone turns up. It's actually preparing and creating an environment and a space where actually you're an employer of choice, for instance, is an example. But the other thing is, anti-racism isn't the responsibility only of people of colour. And because someone is a person of colour and has had the lived experience of racism, doesn't mean that they have the expertise for anti-racism either. So we have to be quite mindful of that when we're having these conversations too.
Yeah, and I think, one of the benefits for us as the Museums Association of operating UK-wide is we get to see the different policy and operating contexts in Scotland, in rural versus city and urban, and in big national institutions versus small volunteer-run, small staffing base institutions, and hopefully support the work in every size and type of institution and across the whole of the UK. And it is challenging in England, and I think some of that drips over the border into Scotland as well in terms of the psyche in the sector. I'm just going to check again. Is there any other questions that you want to put to the panel? There's one here at the front. If you just hang on for the mic. Is there any others? Put your hand up now.
Just a little question for the panel. Does the panel think that as museums are already very white spaces and there's very few people of color in museums, let alone in museum leadership, does the panel think that museums should actively encourage leadership for people of color within museums if there are people like that exist, and having those people in positions of power would mean that the museums and the sector can be more anti-racist and more inclusive and deal with these issues more head on? Because if there is a power imbalance, if all the people of color that exist are in coordinating or other posts or front of house at the bottom, they are not making decisions, or they are not in those teams with those people that do have the power to make a difference, then that also impacts. And is there anything anyone can do to change that?
Thank you, Shanila. That's a great question. And, you know, one that the sector has wrestled with for some time. There's been some visible change around ethnicity, I would say, but not enough, and not enough at leadership level. So I guess it's a question about like, what are the positive steps that we can take? Where's the positive action? What difference do we need to make? Does it need to be a big break change, or is the incremental level of change, which is grindingly slow, sometimes enough?
Well, I don't have a museum background. I have a human rights activist background, anti-racist activist background. And I think we need to see more people, I guess, like me, you know, in the museum sector. There's a few people here today I know who are working in museums and don't have a traditional museum background. So I think that is just one of the ways. There's going to be lots of different ways of doing it. I mean, there's a legal way, which is the positive action steps. You know, I'm not a fan of a deficit model, which is like, let's train Black people because they don't know enough. So, you know, that's the way to do it. These training schemes, you know, Black leadership training schemes and things like that, I'm not really a fan of them, because I think that's a deficit model. But I think we should be training the current white leadership in understanding racism and the nuances of it, and ensuring that they know how to put things in place that will ensure pathways for people of colour and more to move into leadership roles. I think that's just one of them, but there's many.
One thing we found in our work at CRER, particularly around employment, you know, is that there are lots of very, very talented, very qualified Black and minority ethnic people living in Scotland. So it's never similar to what Andrew was saying, actually, it's never this sort of issue of needing to train people, you know, to have people with more of these qualifications. I think that's why this anti-racism work is so important, because it's about creating a space that people of colour actually want to go into and actually want to work in, rather than saying, you know, these people aren't working here because they haven't got the qualifications and skills, because we found in our work that isn't really the case. So I think actually trying to embed anti-racism into the sector, into the sector's cultures, practices, that will then bring the demographics along.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's embedding that culture that's a supportive and a safer and more inclusive environment within the workforce as well, that will hopefully foster some of that and develop those spaces. And I think it's around that understanding at leadership level as well, and building on that. And yeah, we're kind of looking within our Delivering Change programme around what leadership can mean and how we can help to kind of support museums to develop that and kind of give those spaces that will embed that understanding to create a space for more people to move into those spaces.
It's building racial literacy, isn't it? Which is something I know with the leadership team I work with. I mean, you were talking about, Shanila, the leadership team that you have and how you feel supported by them. The other issue is they have to self-educate themselves in racial literacy. One person working in a job or a couple of people of colour working in a space, it's not their responsibility to do that. If you have a role, a leadership role, then you should be upskilling yourself across all areas around equalities to enable you to understand, well, what is your staffing, what kind of job roles are required, you know, what is the shape of our organisation. So, you know, again, it's back to what we said about your first question, you know, why are we doing this when we've got, you know, a cost of living crisis? Well, you've got to do this stuff because you're in the business of people, and therefore it is your job as a leader to understand the demographics of your staff, but also the demographics of your staffing pool in society. And if there's a gap somewhere, then you have to take some action to change that and do something about it.
Thank you. So just two quick plugs actually on upskilling for anybody in the room who's an individual member. You will have access to our Museum Essential online training courses, which cover a range of topics. There's one on anti-racism, which is a brilliant starting point. There's one on decolonisation, which is absolutely fantastic and really, you know, takes you to the next level of thinking. There's lots of reading material, there's lots of video clips, etc. So I think that upskilling piece is one for us all to consider. And also a lot of that resonates with the Culture and Museum X Art Fund report, which is called It's About Handing Over Power, which just looked back over 10, 15 years of training schemes and other initiatives in the sector with the question, why haven't any of these worked, or why haven't most of these worked? And actually what it found was that it was about creating the space. It wasn't a lack of talent. It wasn't a lack of skills. It wasn't a lack of leadership aptitude. It was about hostile spaces. And those spaces as museums not being receptive to people of colour at any level, including leadership level. So there's hopefully some answers to that question in those answers, Shanila. I'm just going to move on a little bit to this question about how the big topics intersect. Because I think in museums we often tend to work in very siloed ways, and I think it possibly comes back to or goes back to how we've collected as institutions on types of collections, and then we kind of replicate that in ways of working. And what I wouldn't want us to do is to think that these big issues are separate. So how do we, and we've touched on this a little bit, how do we bring together, you know, that piece of work around decolonisation and then anti-racism and climate justice and well-being? How do they come together? How do they intersect?
Yeah, sure. So on the climate justice, and I guess this reflects on well-being as well. So there was a UN report by the 5th Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Racism about climate justice, and it outlined that there can't be a meaningful solution to the global climate and ecological crisis without addressing systemic racism, and particularly the historic and contemporary racial legacies of colonialism and slavery. I think that's really powerful because I think a lot of the legacies of slavery and empire, you know, particularly those legacies of how we produce things, you know, that sort of systemic abuse of people and their lands. A lot of the way that has become a real normal part of society is through slavery and empire. It's going back to chattel slavery, systems of empire. So I think it's really important to understand them and combat them. And one of the ways we do that is through anti-racism. So I think that is really key to sort of looking at how we intersect that into an approach on climate as well. You know, in Glasgow, you know, in George Square, we have a statue to James Watt, you know, sort of held as the modern day, you know, father of the steam engine. During COP26 in the city in 2021, there were a lot of protests by environmental groups centered around that figure of James Watt as the father of the Industrial Revolution and responsible, you know, for the start of the climate crisis. And actually as well, James Watt was connected to slavery. You know, the Watt family made lots of money from slavery. James Watt himself was involved in the trafficking of a 6-year-old young African man called Frederick into slavery. So straight away there you have that very direct connection between the two. And I think that's really symbolic for thinking about how the two issues intersect, but also how they've always intersected. And I think our approach to dealing with the climate crisis has to remember that history and has to connect into that, because those histories have always been linked, as has the legacy of them.
And that's a really great concrete example. Although I would say, and maybe this is a question for the audience to consider and reflect on, I think as spaces we feel more comfortable dealing with issues around climate justice than we do dealing with decolonisation, empire, slavery and racism. Just a thought.
Well, one of the annoying racial microaggressions I hear all the time is it's not all about race. Okay, it is actually. They intersect, you know, racism, climate crisis, they're complex issues and we cannot separate them out. And of course, people are going to want to work on things that they feel most comfortable. I mean, I've been having conversations lately in the museum sector, you know, let's work with families, because again, nothing wrong with seeing families as a group that might feel underrepresented within the museum space. However, we're not having to deal with protected characteristics or inequality or issues like that. If we talk about that, let's deal with climate crisis. Again, we're not actually having to deal with the injustice that continues in the global south, but not only in those spaces, in our spaces here, you know, the impact of people who are the diaspora from the global south are dealing with. So absolutely, they want to tease it out because that's to do with their comfort. But actually, we can't do one without the other. They're just, I mean, I think Nelson was so eloquent in how he put that forward, and much more eloquent than I could be about it. And it is, again, because I'm pro museums, I'm not always negative. We have the space to do this. We have the collections, the stories are there. We can do the research, you know, we can pull out those stories to show those intersections and to enable us to have those discussions, quite uncomfortable discussions comfortably, that also enable us to support people who want to take climate action forward, i.e. the communities that we should be working with who want to take that forward. We have a space to be, we do actually have the opportunity to do that. So it's not that, it's about bringing everybody's knowledge and expertise together, you know, talking and working with organisations, talking and working with communities, not expecting all the knowledge and expertise to be in the institution alone, but collaborating, co-producing beyond our own four walls.
Yeah, I think it's a really kind of exciting kind of conversation that, I mean, obviously it's been happening for a long time, but I think there's those intersections are kind of maybe coming out a bit more now, and people are starting to kind of see that if we've got these things that actually they're not separate, and how can we kind of talk about them together and kind of work, as you say, collaboratively on those answers. And I mean, I think one of the things I think is really interesting is around that understanding, and which is the space that museums can be in, around that understanding of those spaces where the colonialism and empire and slavery have been directly linked with the land, and then how that story can be told through the collections. And I think it's really important when thinking about those collections and the interwoven nature of natural history collections into all of these stories as well, and not kind of separating certain collections out, but understanding how connected those are to those histories in the land, and then being able to ensure that we talk about those stories and understand what that means in those contexts. And also just kind of a plug for a conference that's looking at this, the ICOM UK conference, which will be in the same building, is going to be one of the conversations that they're going to be having is around the intersections on the legacies of colonialism and empire, and also on climate as well. So yeah, and I think it's also a really interesting thing just in the last bit around reparations, when we're thinking what can reparations mean. Reparations are also about the lands as well, and thinking about how we connect those as well.
And I just think that no museum can talk about climate justice without mentioning racial justice. It's that simple. And you can start from there and then work backwards and start looking at the history and start thinking about it like that. We're not all going to get, I'm not an expert in that area, but I know enough to know that it's worth looking into and finding out more.
And I think that question of reparations actually is one that we should be looking at as a sector. What does it mean in a museum context? Not just restitution, not just repatriation, but what does that mean in terms of giving back and sharing? I'm going to move on to the last question. I'd like to finish on an example of hope. So I've asked the panelists to give us just one example, which might be a beacon of hope and best practice on one of the topics that we've been talking about today. Who wants to go first?
I mean, I can obviously, there's an example right here, so I will not talk to that example because I think the work that's been done at the Hunterian, obviously the award-winning work that's been done at the Hunterian. Other than that, I think there was a couple of things I wanted to mention was around the engagement that we had with Empire Slavery in Scotland's museums. And I think there was an assumption that around the sector that people would be kind of not engaging with this, but actually there was a huge amount of engagement with the topic, and people really wanted to work together and kind of have those connections and work out and can be supported to move further with it. So I think that's you know, there's a real sense that people do want to work towards this. So I think that gives me a lot of hope. But also just on a general, like something that I just love is our Shared Cultural Heritage project with the Changemakers in Glasgow. So, yeah, thank you, Sheila.
Sure, I can go. Yeah, I would add into that. So last October, we had our programme Black History Month in Scotland. We were able to have like quite a few events from museums that we hadn't had featured before. And I think that was a real positive to me, because that had come about through having and sort of facilitating sessions with, you know, individual museums of all sort of different sizes and different scope. And I think that left me very hopeful because it was all these different museums that had very clear examples of how, you know, Black history had either impacted their area or their space or their collections. And I think just sort of seeing that and seeing that willingness to engage with that was really positive for me.
Well, I'm going to cheekily say, because I believe it, the Hunterian, the work that the Hunterian do, there's the team over there. Not because it's perfect or to showcase, look at, you know, we've done an intervention in a space, whatever, because they are willing to continue the hard work, to continue the difficult, uncomfortable conversations, to continue to make mistakes and fix those mistakes. That's what it really looks like to me. It's not a complete product, it's an ongoing process. But also a beacon of hope is when I think about the three of us here on this panel and how we've collaborated, had conversations. You know, Sheila talks about the SSM process, which was not easy, but we've come out of it intact the other end. You know, the work that Nelson does at CRER and Black History. So we're all connected, and I think that to me is a beacon of hope, and we should just all keep doing the best that we can.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zandra, for bringing your campaigning practice into museums. Thank you, Sheila, for leading on the recommendations delivery. I know that's a big task ahead of us, and we need to support you in that. And thank you, Nelson, for bringing the external lens to museums and your expertise into our practice.
Well, thanks very much for that inspiring session. That was fantastic. Thanks to all the speakers. Also, thanks to Lucy for reminding us to speak clearly into the microphones. I hope that was better. And thanks to Sheila for reminding us to self-describe. I can't believe I forgot to do that, since I did that about 20 times at the MA conference. So a bit late in the day, I am a white man in his mid-50s with short hair and a bit of silver hair as well, as Sandra said, and glasses. So our next session is going to be led by our two reasonably new policy and campaigns officers, India and Joshua. It's going to be on the climate crisis. Joshua works and lives in Cardiff, and India lives and works here in Glasgow. So Joshua and India, do you want to join me? I can't see you at the moment. Oh, there you are. Right, welcome to the stage.
So hi, everyone. So I'm India, and just as a visual description, so I'm a white woman with long curly brown hair. I'm wearing red glasses and also a red dress.
I'm Joshua. I'm black. I'm wearing a green tweed blazer from Zara, and I've got short hair.
So yeah, thanks, Simon, for the introduction. Like Simon said, we're the new policy and campaigns officers for the Museums Association, and we're going to be leading on delivering the Museums Association's campaign work. So we're really looking forward to chatting to you all today about the Museums Association's climate justice campaign. So we're going to speak to you for about 10 minutes, and then we actually have an activity for you. So it'll be a bit of interaction in a little bit. Okay, so here are session objectives for today. So we're going to give you a bit of an overview of the Museum Association's climate justice campaign. We're then going to share some examples of good practice in the sector. And then, like I said, we're going to end with an activity based around how you can take action.
Okie dokie. So our campaign aim. So what do we want you to essentially do? So firstly, it's to raise awareness. So we want you to use your collections, programs, exhibitions, and your learning and engagement portfolio to really raise audiences' awareness of the climate crisis. We want you to champion change. So to work with partners to implement new policies to really raise that awareness, and also we want you to be the change. So we want you to ensure that climate justice is fully embedded into all of the practice that you're doing. So like what has just been discussed, it's not just a bit on the side, but it's deeply integrated into museum work. In response, the MA will advocate on your behalf to make sure that there's necessary resources. We will facilitate partnerships. We will look internally to reduce our carbon reduction plan. And I got the train from Cardiff to Glasgow to here. We definitely are reducing our carbon footprint plan. And we want to embed climate activism across all of our campaigns, but making sure that we are sustaining an intersectional approach. So like discussed, anti-racism and the climate crisis are also linked and embedded into the work that we're doing.
Okay, so what has the Museums Association done so far? So the Museum Essentials on Museums for Climate Justice is now available for you to complete online. And like Sharon said, that's a really great member benefit that you all have. You can all access that free of charge. So I'd really encourage everybody to check that out. The course aims to support your journey, help you think about opportunities where you can make an impact, build your understanding on the issues, and also to build connections with colleagues across the sector. Another resource we have on our website is the Climate Resource Bank, and it's a library of useful tools and knowledge. And it really aims to help build climate action in the museum and heritage sector. So the resources on the Climate Resource Bank are listed under our three main campaign aims. So those are raise awareness, to champion change, and to be the change. So like Joshua has just outlined there. And the Climate Resource Bank really brings together a lot of excellent resources, and it's from a range of organizations. So it's just a really nice kind of one-stop shop for you to kind of begin that journey. And there's some really excellent resources on there, things like examples of museum climate strategies, there's learning resources, and there's also a carbon calculator on there. So really worth taking a look at. So Sarah Kassam is the Museums Association's climate change champion. She's sustainability advisor at UK Sport, and she sits on the Museums Association board as well. She also chairs the Museums for Climate Justice steering group, and she's helping to shape our future work around climate justice. So we're also work very collaboratively with Museums Galleries Scotland, and as I'm sure most of you will be aware, Museums Galleries Scotland recently published Scotland's Museums and Galleries Strategy 2023 to 2030. And climate action is one of the key drivers in the strategy under the resilience strand. So we're really keen to work collaboratively with MGS on that, and to make sure that the work between both organisations is joined up. So as has been already mentioned as well, the conference in 2022 was in Edinburgh, but now we actually have some of the sessions, I think all of the sessions actually, available to watch on our website. So I'd really encourage you to, if you weren't able to make it along at the time, to watch back on some of those sessions. There were some really inspiring sessions on climate justice. So for example, there was a Museums for Climate Justice panel, and there was also and a session on decarbonisation at SS Great Britain. So they're just a few that you might want to take a look at. So I'm going to move on to just showcasing some best practice in the sector now. So the National Mining Museum Scotland was part of Climate Beacons for COP26. I'm sure many of you will be aware that this was a Scotland-wide project led by Creative Carbon Scotland. There were 7 hubs in total, and the Midlothian Climate Beacon was one of those sort of 7 hubs, and it was a collaboration between the National Mining Museum Scotland, between the British Geological Survey and environmental artist Nicole Manley. So the aim of the Midlothian Climate Beacon was to create a transformative journey through the carbon cycle from Scotland's past legacy of fossil fuels towards a future of decarbonisation. And it was really aimed to connect local and international cultures through art and science. So the museum hosted the Climate Reflections and Witness Report series that shared stories of Indigenous people who are already on the front lines of climate change in the global south. With those in Scotland beginning to explore what the crisis will mean for our world. So as part of the project, the museum ensured that there was time for discussion and reflection in the project's transformation room. And one of the key things that really came out during the project was the need to address the emotional impact of the climate crisis. And this was something that was really raised by participants during the project.
So looking at the link between climate justice and decolonisation, I mean, it's really clear. These issues intersect, they are deeply embedded into one another, and dealing with one issue, you're also dealing with the other half. But as we've learned already, museums have a vital role to play in raising awareness and activating communities to create change. And our approach is to sustain that intersectional understanding that tackling the climate justice, also we must tackle anti-racism. We must have a clear focus on looking at decolonising practice. So what does this look like in current practice? And how do we as a sector follow an intersectional approach? Now, in my research for this presentation, I took us all the way down south to Bristol. What I should have done was look to the Hunterian. Because having done the tour this morning, absolutely phenomenal work is being done. India and I had the privilege of going to the Hunterian and looking at some of the work that they're doing there. So they're raising an awareness of climate change and the need to look at these issues with histories of colonial silence and having a clear understanding that these issues do intersect. And I just think from my time there, I've learned 3 key things. And I think the things I would have learned from the Bristol example are perfectly applicable to the Hunterian. So if you've not been, please go. But I think firstly, just being at the exhibition this afternoon demonstrates how bold, creative thinking combined with a strong museum practice can create spaces for reflection, experimentation and conversation, which can generate new audiences and impel new modes of thought and discussion. Secondly, museums do not have to carry the burden of this practice. You don't have to do it alone. You can work with community partners and various groups. And I think in doing so, it puts young people at the centre and it creates greater cultural opportunities for diverse knowledges to be emerged and for new histories to be told. But most importantly, museums do not have to break the bank in thinking and doing differently. And I think from the example of Bristol and looking at the Hunterian, it really shows the power of a low-cost creative initiative to create space to allow unspoken colonial and ecological issues to be given contemporary and necessary expression. And I think it's very clear from this that these are all simple and achievable lessons that we can all implement in our respective practices. So with that in mind, I would like to turn to the person next to you. Give them a high five if you want to. Boom. And so India and I would love for you to discuss That's a very enthusiastic high five. Perfect. So we would like you to discuss the following questions that are on the screen. I wasn't aware that I was going to create such a knee-jerk reaction, but it's nice to know that you're alive. Okay, so firstly, we would like you to discuss in your groups, what could you / your organization do to raise awareness and champion change and be the change? And how could this link with your current work? And secondly, what support would you like from the MA to help you achieve these objectives? You've got 10 minutes on the clock. Time starts now. And 10 minutes. Should we? Yeah, let's join the group. Ooh, that's good fun. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So that sounds like great discussion. And is my microphone on? I'll just project. I'm really keen to hear what people have said and hear maybe 2 or 3 reflections from some of your discussions. Does anybody want to share? You all want to share.
One thing that came up in our discussion was the actual physical space themselves. Hunterian, both our main venues are very energy inefficient in different ways. One's a Victorian building, one's a 70s building. And I know that's a problem across the entire museum sector. Lots of buildings that aren't really fit from a modern purpose, that aren't insulated, that have outdated heating systems. So this is proper pie in the sky stuff, because I know there wouldn't be the money for this, but the sort of support which would be nice would be some sort of fund to bring buildings up to standards. It does feel kind of quite difficult to talk meaningfully and truthfully about climate change when we work in spaces that are so poorly insulated in many cases, and so energy inefficient, and kind of just a place where we are negatively impacting the environment on a daily basis.
Anybody else?
So we had quite an interesting discussion. I look after a large wooden ship, and someone sitting here who, through her work, looks after historic buildings in Glasgow. And we were talking about limited supply chains of reasonably sourced materials that have to also match funders' requirements of like-for-like replacement. So our ship took 1,000 oak trees to build, and is probably about 20% needed replaced now. We can't get those materials in Scotland. We can't even get them in England. We're going to have to import from probably somewhere pretty unsustainable, with no real commitment to biodiversity or anything like that. And we're also talking about what happens when Scottish slate stops being quarried and your fund is still going, but you have to get it from Scotland. And apparently, was it Spain you were saying that a lot of it's coming from? Yeah. So sorry, it's another bricks and mortars question, but we would maybe like, so we're thinking that we're probably going to have to plant our own forest to think for the next, no, actually, because us and Discovery and Dundee have the same problem. HMS Victory have already started planting or planning their forest. So for the next 100 years, okay, for us, that's relatively easy, but okay, so who's going to open up a quarry for materials in Scotland? So from the MA, maybe we would like to flag up to regulators and funders that it's all very well saying you've got to replace like for like materials and skills. Skills is one thing, but materials, there has to be, okay, so who's going to cough up for the very uncommercial model that will need subsidizing for? So yeah.
Thank you. There's one more. Two more.
I was very enthusiastic there. I'm sorry about that. So we were just talking about something completely different, actually, which was around sharing sometimes the small unseen things that might be very positively going on in organizations, such as positive procurement choices or just work that could be in little pockets of activity in organizations that sometimes don't seem like the best or biggest thing that's going on, but is creating waves of positive change in the organization. So it was just perhaps identifying those and just making sure that the MA are sharing scalable things that are really exciting for all different types of organizations.
Thank you.
It was just to go off the back of your ship. My husband works in an industry where he has to design things that are meant for people in 100 years' time that might not recognize the language that we speak now. We might not speak English in 100 years' time. We might have some other evolved language, and so he has had to try and create maybe symbols that can be universally recognized, in decades, centuries time. So going back to the boat and planting the forest and sustainability and the buildings that we have, the majority of our museums in that are historic old buildings that weren't made for today's schools of thought of longevity and environment. It is about putting those practices in place that will last 100 years. It's what we do now is extremely important, but what we do now has to have that plan for 100 years' time, for 200 years' time, that somebody can carry on with it and evolve it as it's going along. It has to be a working plan that we've done it, okay, great, but we can't forget about it. We have to make sure that it's sustainable enough for someone else to carry on with it once we've all gone and left.
Thank you.
So thank you all for your contributions. That's been very, very valuable. And this is really going to help shape how the Museums Association take forward our climate justice campaign. And it will really help to inform what resources and support we can offer going forward. We're also going to be working with our Museums for Climate Justice Steering Group and working with them quite closely and collaboratively on next steps for the campaign. So really just watch this space. We'll be planning more things shortly to help offer support. But I'd also say if anybody wasn't able to share today and you do want to kind of feedback, please do email me. My email is india@museumsassociation.org. I'd really love to hear what came out of your discussions as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, India and Joshua. That was a great session. It was lovely to hear you all chatting together. There's more time for chatting now because we've got a 25-minute break. So you can go and get some fresh air or chat in groups, or also Tamsin's offering a drop-in session to talk about careers. So if you'd like to talk to Tamsin about your career, please hear Tamsin is. And we're due back here at 4:15 for the final two sessions and a bit of networking and drinks. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice time to chat. We've got 2 more sessions to go. The first one is going to be Tamsin Russell, Vimeo, talking about wellbeing. So that will for about 45 minutes. Then we'll finish off looking at a fantastic Esme Fairbairn Collection Fund project being developed by the Scottish Cranach Centre. And then after that, we'll have about 40 minutes for networking and drinks out there. So I'll now hand over to Tamsin Russell.
I think that's the first step actually for all of our well-being, is to remember how fantastic we all are, because I think often that's not the case when we're doing with lots of work and challenges. So I am delighted to be here in this room with these amazing people, and also at home for the viewers at home, to talk about the Museums Association's commitment to well-being. And we've been committed to wellbeing for a long time. We've done a range of different activities, programs, content. But what I'm really excited about is that we've put this now under a very clear umbrella of a campaign that brings all those different parts together. So I have slides, primarily because you don't only want to be listening to me, you might want to be looking at some content. And I also know that individuals may want to share some of the content that I've talked in your own organisations with friends, family, relatives. So if you do want a copy of the presentation, please do let me know. I can send you the PDF. So we do have a wellbeing campaign for the first time at the Museums Association, a very specific and focused campaign. And what am I going to be talking about today? I'm going to talk about the approach that we've taken, particularly the research. I'm going to talk about 2 bits of research. I'm going to talk about the wellbeing research, and I'm also going to talk about the pay research and our pay report and recommendations. And then how does that contribute to our approach of being more proactive and most strategic around our campaigning around this. Going to talk about some of the key findings and the recommendations. And for those of you that are sitting in the audience, you know, if you are operating in a leadership or a management space, please pay attention to the recommendations. Certainly from a well-being perspective, we have not included any recommendations that operate at an individual level, because we feel that individuals are often highlighted as the people that need to change their behaviour within the organisational context. And if we have learnt nothing from our brilliant speakers before this, it's the organisations that need to be changing their welcome, their environment, so that we can all thrive. There is going to be a breakout, so you will have time to talk. We're not going to do death by feedback, but I would encourage you. One of the things I found recently, I'm going to sound like a right Luddite. 2 things I found recently is notes on my iPhone. Yeah, I've had it for however many years. And also audio notes on my iPhone that now transform me preparing conversations like this. So when we do get to the breakout stage, for those of you guys in the room, you might want to take a few notes on any device or paper if you would prefer, but would absolutely encourage you then to send that through to me, just because I've got something to do next week because I've got nothing else on. And for those of you in Zoom, my fantastic colleague Rebecca will be putting you into Zoom breakouts, and you again can have a conversation and then share your insights using the chat function. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what does that look like in terms of making change. So we are a campaigning organisation, and this is just some of the campaigns that we feel are critical for the museum sector. And my role specifically works under the workforce area. And if you look at our campaign pages, you'll see that we're committed to fair work, and we've got this really strong identity around inclusive and diverse museums, fair working practices, and workforce wellbeing. And as I've already said, this is not our first rodeo, as it were, to wellbeing. We have done other work. And if you're not familiar with our work around sticks and stones, bullying research, our front of house charter for change, and it's been so lovely to hear from front of house colleagues today, our redundancy hub and our wellbeing hub, all of that information is on our website. Please use it. And if you think there are any gaps, let me know, because again, I've got nothing on. Your wish is my command. So what were our aims? I'm not going to talk through every single bullet point, but ultimately our approaches are around getting a sense of what the current picture was within the sector at an individual level. Our focus was on everybody, so volunteers, freelancers and employees in the sector. And we wanted to sort of drill down to some more detail around what the key factors were that were having a negative impact on individual well-being within the sector. And for that to enable us to have conversations with ourselves, the MA, and also with you guys around what those priorities might be. So I'll be coming back to that shortly. We had a really high response rate for this wellbeing research. So we got 658 responses. And that means that we feel really comfortable and confident around our next steps. Although what I would say is that we didn't get as high a representation across or participation across all of the areas of the UK nation. So we got very low participation rates from Northern Ireland and also from museum professionals of colour and also freelancers. We got much lower participation rates. So that's the areas we want to focus on as well in terms of more research is needed. As part of our approach and through all of our wellbeing work, we have defined wellbeing in this way. We think that it's important to acknowledge that wellbeing happens at home and at work, but they're not mutually exclusive, and there is flow between both. Okay, so it's important that we understand the implications and consequences of poor workforce well-being in the workplace and how that drips out into our lives or gushes depending on what the situation is. And we're also really clear that well-being isn't a nice to have. I've worked in the sector long enough for it to often be touted as a priority, but then when push comes to shove, guess what? It isn't. It's often used performatively or sometimes even as a red herring. Oh, you can't do that because I'm worried about your well-being. Really? You weren't worried about it last week, but suddenly you are worried now when I want to do something. So we're really clear that as organisations, it is a very clear demonstration of a healthy organisation. Okay, this is something we should all be paying attention to. And during my time in HR, and I reflect on this in the moment, there's such an obsession about absence rates and attendance rates, that deficit model that we've talked about. And whilst those are absolutely symptomatic potentially of wellbeing issues, we shouldn't be focusing on who's not turning up for those reasons. We should be focusing on how do we make sure those people don't have to not turn up to begin with because they're not broken or traumatized. Gosh, I'm getting very deep. In terms of the CIPD and their work, and that's the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, they've identified 7 wellbeing domains. And we, in terms of our questionnaire design, looked at this as a nice starting point, and you'll see, shocker, a lot of the reflections from that research resonate. So here we've got aspects around health, that's physical, mental and emotional health. And it was interesting to hear previous speakers talking around eco-anxiety as a function of work on climate justice, as well as emotionally laden work when we're talking about decolonising practice and anti-racism practice. This concept of good work, so actually we've got meaningful, interested, varied work and we're allowed to do it. There's something about individuals seeing their values and principles represented in the organisations that they work in and valued in the organisations they work in. And that's often where we see a bit of a rub, certainly where organisations go through change. Something around collective and social. And I think certainly for everybody that's glad to be back in person, people probably know my views, that can also be hugely supportive. So the risks of lone working, isolated working, working from home have not necessarily contributed well in terms of well-being experiences. Very clear aspect around personal and professional growth as being really high contributor to workforce well-being, and then financial aspects. So we need to be able to put food on the table and a roof over our head. Those should be our bare minimums, and we should need more than that. They also talk outside of the working environment around our lifestyle choices, and I've just put those on the side. Moving swiftly on. So what are our aims in terms of this campaign? Our aims are very similar to our other campaigns. We are in a fortunate position to be able to reach, inspire, she says, hopefully, and develop individuals and organisations in the sector to step up to this. So we're doing most of the heavy lifting for you. We've done the research. We've got this bit of content. We've got this museum essential over here. We've got this conference session. We want then to support you a little bit more to do that. And that is about how do you take your workforce wellbeing seriously? And also, what does that look like in terms of designing robust and supportive community wellbeing activities? So what are our key findings? So I'm really happy to say the majority of respondents reported good life satisfaction. And I know when we fed this back, because the window of this research was in the summer of last year when everyone was working up how much gas prices were going to be, there was certainly a discussion about this was a surprise. You know, we've just come out of a pandemic, the Ukraine war is on, and then cost of living. But what it highlighted very clearly is that individuals, 71% of respondents had a really good life satisfaction. So their ability to be happy and content was absolutely there. That did not reflect well in terms of work satisfaction. So 58% of people said that their experience of work wasn't positive. So what I can take sort of encouragement from to a greater degree is from this very tiny piece of research is that leaching into the home life hasn't necessarily happened. Otherwise, we'd see slightly different stats here. OK, so it looks like people are miserable at work, but are managing to keep it there, which, of course, is not a good situation to be in. But that's what we're here to talk about. In terms of factors affecting well-being, excessive demands was highlighted as the biggest one, and not a huge surprise there. I keep saying to people, you know, during the pandemic, we stopped doing A and we started doing B as we shifted, as we pivoted. And then in 2022, we decided we were going to do A and B again with fewer staff and often fewer hours. So I'm not surprised those excessive demands have been seen as the most significant factor in terms of people's well-being. A third of respondents, though, felt that they were not cared for in work and that their organisation did not prioritise their own well-being. And I mean, that's huge in terms of if we were going to scale that up in terms of the number of people that work in the sector. Also, there were a number of responses where there was no wellbeing support at all. So that it was either as a line manager level or in terms of other programs, and I'll talk about that in a moment. What we did find is that museums that had put different wellbeing interventions into place were most commonly employee assistance programs and mental health first aiders. I mean, I think it's great that we have mental first health aiders. My concern would be, is that too late? By the time I'm using one, and I know I need to use one, actually has the horse not already bolted? Also, there was certainly a sense that these interventions were blanket interventions. So that individualistic approach, again, that previous speakers talked about, wasn't really there. It was like, we're applying this policy. So, you know, everyone has to do yoga, even if while you're doing your yoga session, you're panicking around the fact that you've got like 1,000 emails in your email box, but yoga's the way forward. And I'm not dismissing those yoga events. We ourselves at the Museums Association had yoga on a Wednesday morning. I think I participated in 2 with my camera off. But we need to make sure that we are not applying just broadly, bluntly interventions that don't really get to the heart of the matter, but are performative and visible and keep our funders or our board happy up here. In terms of the positive experience of wellbeing, and there were some, I was thinking when I was listening to everybody earlier on, I was like, oh, this sounds like a really miserable session today. All we're talking about is all these big issues that we're having to deal with. But people did have positive experiences of work. And for those line managers in this room that are doing it well, it's all to do with you. A lot of that was around the interactions and the spaces you create for your staff to feel cared for, supported, and listened to. And that came across very, very strongly. And that supportive team and engaging job content also around values was high. There has been a clear shift towards hybrid working, and from our respondents, only 30% of people described their role as being on site in the majority of the time. And the findings very much were, even of that 30%, they would like to, if they could, barring operational roles from a front of house perspective, like to be working from home because of the benefits. Now, I have long discussions with people that want to be in the office and don't want to be in the office. I think it is the most individualistic conversation you need to have as a line manager, and to not make assumptions and not to project your own preferences on the people that you manage. We also, at the same time, did some triangulation of this research. So we did the pay research at the same time, but with a slightly different audience. So our pay research was at an organisational level, whereas our wellbeing research was at an individual level. And what we found in terms of that research was that employee assistance programmes were still a very popular choice, that hybrid working was in place, and that museums were introducing different initiatives. So as part of that pay research specifically, we have made some direct recommendations, which is around challenging organisations to think about workforce wellbeing far more holistically. So it isn't about yoga, it's about yoga, pay, season ticket loans, how you're treated at work. So it's holistic in nature rather than being siloized. And again, I think that's a theme really that's run across today's session around the relatedness of everything that we're exposing ourselves to. And that employers should set aside a budget, whether that is financial or a budget in terms of resource and time, to ensure that these things are prioritised. And we would recommend you all look at our research. So what about the recommendations from the wellbeing research? So these recommendations, I'm just going to talk through again, just to highlight, but there is this overarching commitment to care. I did a session last week in Hampshire online, and someone said, how do you prioritise well-being in an organisation that's going through a lot of change? And I was like, well, first of all, is it an agenda item on your team meeting? Oh, no. Okay, well, make it visible, make it something you talk about. So it's not something you get to at last, but you get to at first. Is it on your organisational risk register? Is it on your project risk register? Have you done well-being risk assessments on your staff around the nature of the work that they're doing? So committing explicitly to prioritising well-being, and you can do it in just some of those ways, can be really, really helpful. And that is around that planning, budgeting and risk assessment decision making. There is something around making sure that people aren't having to do two people's jobs just because you said you were going to do two pieces of work. Those excessive demands, remember 58% or 53% of people said that was significant. And ensuring that where there is well-being support available, that it is known and available to staff that are not necessarily seen as back of house. So if I'm going to be putting a yoga session on, I shouldn't be saying to my front of house staff, well, you can't come, you need to cover the desk. The yoga's just for me. Okay, so thinking really clearly about inclusion all the way through. Policies and practices move quickly in this area, as do interventions, and we really wanted people to make sure that they were analysing and evaluating any of the interventions they put in place for their staff, so that we are building rather than just going through. Again, I'm going to use the yoga example. I could use cakes as an example as well. And measure wellbeing regularly. So if you're a line manager in this space, ask about your staff's wellbeing, not when they come back from a time off of absence, but as a regular part of your one-to-ones, as part of your appraisal process on that team meeting. If you've got employee surveys or satisfaction surveys, use that as a nice measure year on year, month on month. You might even also want to include it in exit interviews to identify whether that was the reason for leaving. Okay, obviously you've missed your boat with that person, but hopefully it can form your practice for the future. Develop skills to support well-being. I would like to say this is a human skill, but I've worked with humans long enough to know that sometimes people need additional help. So if you know, for whatever reason, you're less people oriented, or you like to have a step-by-step blueprint roadmap, then think about how you can develop your skills to support others. And send to these people throughout all of your conversations. Don't have a conversation about somebody's well-being if they're not in the room. So I've got an example where somebody recently said, oh, do you know what, I don't think you need to be doing this anymore. You're not going to do this anymore. And I was like, well, why not? Well, we think, you've got a lot on. I was like, well, let me tell you what I've got on, and let me tell you what taking that piece of work away from me has an impact on my well-being? So have those conversations where the person is in the room, not making assumptions about somebody else. And these conversations are so important. And wherever possible, and I appreciate it's not possible, and we are really committed around equity within the sector, is around thinking about where possible hybrid working. So I am hearing on the grapevine lots of organisations doing a big pendulum shift back into you need to be in the office 3 days a week, you need to be in the office 4 days a week. I don't know what the evidence is around this. You know, the evidence, actually, I do know. The evidence is really clear around home working having a positive impact broadly on the majority of the workforce. It's still an individual conversation, but we shouldn't be applying broad brush policies. It smarts to me of perhaps not trusting and a whole raft of other things. So key factors affecting well-being: 53% of people, excessive demands. This is within your gift as a line manager. As an individual, you might want to push back. Also other aspects around not feeling valued or recognised, not being paid in an appropriate way, having a negative culture, toxicity, as well as opportunities for progression. In terms of what do organisations do at the moment, and then we're going to go on to breakouts. As I've said, employee assistance programs is the highest part in terms of what people do. And then what we're also seeing is mental first aiders, wellbeing policies that are only as good as if they're implemented well and consistently with an individual focus. And then also other opportunities around training and occupational health. So the final thing I want to leave you with before I get you to have a 10-minute breakout is the other aspect of this research, which was also looking very specifically at the link between how we prioritise community engagement and wellbeing projects. But what does that mean for the person that's doing them? So how many people in this room or at home, I'm just going to imagine you putting a little hand up, work on community engagement and outreach projects? Okay, so quite a number. I would say for people at home, about 20. What we found through the research was that not all organisations prioritise community wellbeing. It's maybe not their mission, vision or values. I mean, I challenge that, as you'd expect, because I work for the MA, but so there was a difference around that. For those organisations that did prioritise that wellbeing, they did put good measures in place to support the well-being of the people that were participating. Okay, that's great. However, the flip of the coin was to what extent, so all those people that just put your hand up, can you put your hand up again? This is just a little tiny bit of well-being exercise. No, not really. So what you might find though in your organisation is that you weren't then further supported in your ability to do this. So if you can imagine, I was thinking about that intersectionality around a relationship between cost of living for workforce and cost of living for community. And every time those two meet in a space, I am potentially absorbing that emotional load from that person. And if you take it outside of the museum walls into other projects and other communities that might well be facing all of those three things we've just talked about, it's the person that's holding that space that might then be literally absorbing that experience, that emotion, that emotionally laboured and burdened work. And our organisations aren't stepping up to put in that safety net. So again, if it's within your gift, make that change. So our recommendations are that we feel that if you are in a community-based role, you should have access internally or externally to additional support and guidance, and that there should be a very clear induction programme for everybody working in community spaces, and that resources need to be there to enable you to have respite between those programs. We get the funding quickly, then we go and implement it. And then what do? We do all of those workshops in succession so that you can get it out the other door without any opportunity to reflect and recover, either for the communities you're working with or yourselves. So there's some really basic things. So what am I going to get you to do in the next 10 minutes? I am going to ask you to talk in small groups and breakout rooms for those of you in Zoom to, I suppose, just reflect back to me a reality check. So have a conversation. These are prompts, and we're not going to go through everything. What does everyone think for reality checks? But I want you to sort of say, you know, actually, is this meaningful? Does this resonate? Or is this hugely surprising? I'd like you to think about good practice. So I find it hard when people say, who's doing this well, Tamsin? I'm like, I heard a really great example from the Highlanders Museum in Fort George last week, and their CEO, Ailey Young, talked about how she has instigated a wellbeing policy and a wellbeing plan for every single member of her team, so that everyone reflects on what enables them to be positive and thriving and what their triggers are when not. And they then have that conversation. Now, I was going to say how easy is that, but it's fairly straightforward to start that, especially if you're working in a small team. So is there good practice out there? Please email me so I can create case studies. And what else would you like us to be doing? Ultimately, any other reflections and questions? You've got 10 minutes to do that. We will come back at about 10:02, and I will then give a little bit more information about pay and deal with any questions or concerns. Is everyone clear about what we're going to do for the next 10 minutes, online and in person? Wonderful, go. We can continue over wine. For those of you that are in person, I'll send my wine vibes to everybody that's online. Wine is often a maladaptive coping mechanism to well-being experiences. So any sort of reflections, just briefly, or anything that anyone wants to say? I know sometimes people like to share more verbally, but there's no requirement to. Anyone want to say anything? I've got my valuable assistant to my side with the microphone ready to go. Fantastic.
I just want to say, I mean, this is all really, really positive, the research and, you know, the initiatives and everything that you're talking about. But I think just reflecting on things that I've spoken with people here and, you know, elsewhere, I do really worry that the sector itself is really at a crisis point when it comes to people remaining in the sector. When it comes to cost of living crisis, I mean, we were having these conversations even before the problems that are arising now. You know, I was asked the other day to do a job seminar or sort of to encourage people coming from a sort of a non-traditional background to get into the heritage sector, into the museum sector. And I honestly, in good conscience, didn't feel like I could do that because I just didn't feel like it was a sector that I could really say, yes, this is something that's worth getting involved in. It's a passionate sector for sure, but unfortunately, our passion doesn't pay the rent and put food on the table. So sorry, that's a bit of a negative statement, but I do think that all the line managers that are here or listening online, it's really important because we are hemorrhaging staff at the moment to be thinking about pay and well-being. These aren't little things. We're losing a lot of really good people constantly.
I think we just have to be really honest. So I would absolutely, people ask me, or should I join the sector? I was like, well, so what's your motivation? And it's hard. You don't want to be selling, you don't want to be selling a non-existent career path to somebody if that's not going to be then. It's not even going to be a nice one to get nowhere. You know, it's going to be a hideous one to get nowhere. So I absolutely think, and we should all be honest about our experiences and where we think there should be aspects to improve. What more generic research would say is that pay tends to become an issue once everything else, like we'll put up with it for as long, we'll put up with that poor pay as long as we are doing interesting work, are valued, recognised, developed, supported, all of those, motivated, all those lovely things. But when those go as well, that's it. That's that point where everyone jumps. So there are lots of things that are cost neutral if you are in a small organisation that has no latitude for payroll budget moving to make the experience of work positive, although absolutely, please pay me more. So in terms of factors that affected well-being, and welcome back to everybody online, I just really wanted to make the links between these three, because I think the Museum Association does such good work and we're operating in all those different areas. But I think sometimes it's hard to say, well, how does this all marry up? What else is there? So I just wanted to highlight low pay in the last 6 minutes, as well as progression, as well as recognised. So in 2 minutes, let's go. So if you haven't already read it, please read the salary recommendations and research. It very much talks to the well-being research that came out, which highlighted these areas. So 44% of people felt that their well-being was negatively affected by essentially poor pay and financial precarity, as well as lack of job security, etc. If you can use our research and the pay research to try and influence the powers that be in terms of funding or conversations, then please do that. We've done that heavy lifting for you. In terms of our findings, we found very clearly that we haven't kept in pace for inflation, that compared to salaries from our previous survey in 2017, that again, it's less than the average that we had at that point. Very much behind the market. Now, our research basically was window research in terms of what is everyone being paid. And we're trying to reflect that. So it's also called mirror research. And then we benchmark against other similar roles. And that's a bit of a challenge for our organisation or our sector. There aren't that many comparable roles to do that with. So it has been a bit of a challenge. But we are seeing that this pay gap is widening and has done since our last research. And that ultimately, whilst there have been some good news stories, very limited, I should say, as a function of national living wage and changes around the lowest paid in the sector, on average, we fail to keep up. Okay. Now, in terms of what we're expecting people to be doing, again, I'm not going to read through absolutely all these recommendations, but it's fairly straightforward in terms of thinking around how do you get the funders to fund roles at the appropriate level? How do you make sure that you are challenging? Well, we only ever paid that person that much. I even heard recently that around this whole still idea about PIN money, well, they're not the primary breadwinner, you know, so they don't need to be paid more. Whereas if they were you know where that's going, can't you? So there is something around absolutely taking a point back and looking at your pay policy, looking at your organisational design. You might also want to look at your job evaluation models if you have them. There are so many ways in which you could look to implement some of our recommendations. And one of the clear ones is around inclusive recruitment. So please, please, please always include the salary. We know that if you're a woman of colour, you are less likely to negotiate hard on a salary. So if it is opaque, competitive salary, then it's less likely that I will get the same salary as if Simon tries to negotiate that salary. So there's really, really basic things that you need to or can put in place. Our research wasn't around freelancers because that was a different population. We are absolutely committed to supporting freelancers in this space and want to do as much as we can. So please let us know what else we can do. But we do want to make sure that everyone sees freelancers as the wellbeing agenda as well as the pay agenda as a clear part of our core workforce ecosystem, and to pay fairly on time and not try to rush to the lowest possible person, but the salary that equates to the skills that somebody brings. So look at your organizational design, look at your job evaluation models if you have them. If you've got a pay policy, review it. If you've not got a pay policy, write one. Think about the remuneration package. What are the other pulls and pushes that will make somebody's experience of work more positive? So, for example, I now get £50 for wellbeing every year. Can't wait. I'm buying geraniums on the 1st of April. And I also then get a lump sum because I work from home. Those are, compared to last year, £250 worth of stuff I never got before. That's huge. And that's not about salaries. It's non-consolidated. So it can be taken away at any time. Obviously, hopefully they won't do that. But it is a way of bridging that gap, that immediate response. So there are ways and means we could do that. So use this research, look at the pay and wellbeing research, read it, share it, apply it in all of your professional practice, explore your organisation's policies and approaches, and really think about what that might look like. Because ultimately, we are all part of the workforce. And so it's in our own interests not to vote for Christmas. And on that point, I'm going to close and hand over to Simon. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks so much, Tamsin. It's a really interesting session as well. So we've got one more session to go before we can have some drinks and a bit more networking. I'm delighted to say we've got four people from the Scottish Cranach Centre who are going to join us to talk about a project that's been funded by the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund. I think so. Hopefully they'll come up now. Just before they start, for those of you who don't know the fund, the MA has distributed £11 million since for the last 12 years, I think, since 2011 through the fund. So it's a really great fund. And the next round of funding, I think we need expressions of interest by the 5th of April. So do look on the MA website. We've got a funding section that contains information about the fund and all the other funding we provide. So over to you.
So hello everyone, my name is Rachel. I'm one of the assistant directors at the Scottish Cranach Centre, and I just wanted to say that there's four of us because everyone at the museum has been involved in this project, and it is more than just a project, but we couldn't pick who could come, and we managed to narrow it down to four without having to shut the museum for a day. So we're just going to run through descriptions and then we're going to get started with Amy, who's our new curator in position. So you have to give her a clap at the end as well. So my name is Rachel. I'm white and I have a lot of curly hair and I'm wearing glasses and a yellow top because it's my favourite colour.
Hi everyone, my name's Jess. I am also fairly new to the museum industry. I'm white, I've got fairly long brown hair, I'm wearing glasses and a pink and white stripy top.
Hello, I'm Jenny. Gingery hair, black top, green eyes. Should we all have a little seat after this? That's what I do. Yes.
Hi, so I'm Amy. I am a white woman. I have long brown hair and I'm wearing a white jumper today. So I'm just quickly going to introduce the project itself. So we are examining two pottery assemblages, both dated to around 500 BC. One's from our Cranach site, so Oakbank on Loch Tay, and the other is from the Isle of Lewis, called Dunbarabak Cranach. These assemblages are really, really different, so particularly in fabric, quality and decoration. So at Oakbank itself, we have really small quantity of pottery. All of it's really thick, really roughly made, and it has minimal decoration on it. Whereas Dunbarabak is the opposite. We have a really large quantity of pottery. It's really finely made and it's really highly decorated. So we believe that they had a variety of uses on Dunbarabak as well. So we think using for several different things, while at Oakbank, just for cooking pots. Neither collection is being catalogued, displayed, examined, anything like that. So it's not been accessed by the public before. So the first thing we want to do in this project is get it all catalogued, displayed, and we are eventually going to create a new museum display on our new site in the summer. So one unexpected feature of the Dunbarabak assemblage is that there's lots of pieces, base pieces that have fingerprints embedded into them. This is really important to us because we feel it's a nice way for people to physically connect themselves to the past and showing that anyone can leave their own mark on history. So with this being said, we are focusing on the assemblages and creating a community involvement. So we're trying to develop new relationships with different community groups and then find a way to maintain these relationships in the future. So we've strived to create a project that could be inclusive and relatable. So pottery is something that is historically everywhere. So even today, it can be involved in something as simple as having a cup of tea, say, creating that warm, safe space within a group. But it's not always just for domestic uses. So we see it quite a lot, especially as we're an Iron Age site and things like blacksmithing and forging. And this just shows how resilient pottery is as a material. So it withstands a lot of heat and it survives this. So we chose to work with many different groups, including Women's Aid Perth, RASAC, which is Rape and Sexual Assault Centre in Perth, Maryhill Integration and Bernardo's. And they are going to help us create an organisation where there are 1,000 fingerprints and 1,000 voices in everything that we do. So by the end of this project, we'll be created a brand new pottery display, which will be opened in our new museum, as I mentioned. The display will be co-curated with all these community groups, so they will have a big say in what we're doing with the assemblages, and we'll be creating some replica pots as well with local clay from the area. So I'm now going to hand over to Jess and Jenny, who are going to talk a bit more in detail about our community involvement.
So Amy's mentioned some of the groups that we're working with, and I thought I would take you through sort of the planning process of that. So how we're actually carrying out our outreach or inreach. So it does involve a lot of planning. We do a lot of communicating with our groups beforehand. We want to know what they need and want, and what their individual service users need and want as well, so that we can then provide the best experience for them. When we go to them or they come to us, we always have a variety of activities planned, but we try and let the group that we're working with lead. So if they're more interested in one thing, we'll do that more. If they're more interested in another, we can drop an activity and replace it really easily. This is really, really effective when working with kids, especially as their attention can be grabbed by the funniest of things. So we'll bring lots of pottery, lots of different things, and they'll just want to play with puppets all day, which is absolutely lovely. And it's exactly what we're there for. We are there to provide the resources, and they're there to use them however they see fit. So with regards to pottery, we do try and always take a little bit of our assemblage with us. So that's 2,500 euro pottery, and we deal with it in the most accessible way possible. So we do what's called a dry wash, where we're literally using makeup brushes and sponges, because they're very, very soft. Soft enough to use on human skin means it's soft enough to use on pottery, and everyone can have a little brush really gently. It's quite therapeutic. It's really calming. You can do it for as long or short as you like. We also bring a lot of air dry clay as well, and clay is a really lovely forgiving material. You make a mistake, you can just rub it out, you can change it, you can make a useful object, you can make a fun object, you can just squish it about a bit, and it's safe as well when working with kids if they fancy eating a bit of it, which is something we had to keep in mind as well. So some of the other things that we've done with the groups, we recently did wreath making workshops, as well as bring along pottery, and there we're using sustainable materials, things that people can personalize. What was really important for this, that was a workshop we did with Women's Aid Perth, was that it was just around the Christmas time, and a lot of these women didn't have time for themselves, and we wanted to provide something where they could do something for themselves at no cost to them. We got actually, Rachel got a local florist to help provide us some really beautiful greenery, flowers, things that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise without the help from a wider community for this, which I think is just really, really important and really, really heartwarming to see that people do want to help when you ask. People are fundamentally good, I think, is what I've taken from this experience. It's been really important to me personally doing this for a variety of reasons. I didn't know about a lot of these groups. I'm new to this country. I've recently moved from mainland Europe. So knowing that there are these support groups out there is really inspiring as well, that people give their time for this. I also can't speak for the rest of the room, but I personally don't know any women who haven't experienced at least sexual harassment in some form or another.
Yep, and I was also working on doing outreach and inreach with all these groups, and it's just one of the most rewarding things that I've done. As a, personally, sort of survivor of domestic abuse, and my children too. And at that time had nothing available to me at all in terms of support or resources. It's just fantastic to be able to relate and be able to pay back, and just watch the difference that it makes. It's just, it's a great thing to get involved in. And at the Cranach Centre as well, we've got quite a unique setting, which is a very relaxing space. There's a strong sense of community that just about everyone comments on when they come for a visit. They get that real feel of community. Looking back through history, it's really quite a recent thing that we're not living in extended family type situations. So having that kind of community feel and involvement is just a really helpful thing to be able to offer. And just that very simple thing of sitting around in a circle, making a very simple craft. Pottery, as Jess said, is just very forgiving. If it doesn't work out, you can just mash it up and start all over again. And it's just a very nice thing. We don't tend to sit around in groups anymore, really chatting. And it's it's really successful, I think. And I'm looking forward to doing more of it.
So, sorry. So just to finish off, I suppose we are the project has been funded by the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund and the Headley Fellowship, and by us, to be honest, because there's been so many other things that we wanted to do. And then it's crept into other work as well. So Jenny and Jess, Amy wasn't there. No, Jenny and Jess were at Glasgow Association for Mental Health on Monday, running the final session of a live workshop session. And that ended up just being kind of a pottery project session with Glasgow Association for Mental Health, totally separate from anything else that we were doing, but it's just worked really well. So it's informed a lot of our learning. So basically we're 12 months into the project and it's an 18-month project. So what we've done is through this process, we've kind of reflected and evaluated on how it's gone all the way through. So we've had a lot of conversations with the people that have been part of the project and also their organisations and their centre managers to look at what's been successful, what hasn't been successful, what do we need to change. And as a result of that, we've gone back to Esme Fairbairn a couple of weeks ago, to the lovely people there, and said, can we maybe use the final bit of money to do something similar but slightly different, do some more concentrated work with one particular group, which is Perth Women's Aid, simply because they've identified a gap in the service that they actually provide that the museum can then help to fill. And because a museum is so different to what the organisations that they normally work with, and we had a video that we were going to play from Perth Women's Aid, but we can't play it. But what that means is basically they sort of said they have kind of they're dealing with trauma and in a very, very imminent place where you're literally going through it. So then it's a case of let's help get this family or this woman out of that, or let's support in the initial process. Then they have an aftercare group, which is more around looking at how what's your next steps? When you can see beyond the thing that's right in front of you, when you can see a little bit further, what's your next steps? And that's kind of where we can come in. So museums have so many different aspects to them, from curatorial to community work to cafe to retail to we have open air as well, so outdoor stuff. And there's lots and lots of work experience. There's lots and lots of opportunities to work as part of a team to relearn life skills that you maybe need to need a bit of support with at that point. And this isn't coming from us, this is coming from Perth Women's Aid, what they've asked for. So we went back to them a couple of weeks ago and said, this is what we've spoken to Esme Fairbairn, we're okay, what should we do? Like, let's look at this again. And the plan is amazing. So it's looking at further in reach. So one of the problems is we're in a really rural place. They're in a city. They can't get to us. So we go into them. And that's not only working with the aftercare group, but also working with a children's group that we're going to set up with them. So they often do individual counselling with specific children, but they never meet. So that can be quite isolating. So instead, it's a case of, well, the Crannog Centre will come in to do group sessions with that group, so you don't feel on your own anymore. We're also going to work on team building. So the first thing they said was our team need a break, which is again very related to the wellbeing presentation before. And also we've been just chatting about there's things we need to put in place now, as well as we're increasing the work that we're doing. But they need team away days. So coming to the Crannog and doing something where they can step away from the job that they're doing and get a bit of respite. And also we have a new training platform. So for example, somebody's interested in going into a job and they need a food hygiene qualification, then we can provide that for free. There's no reason why they should be paying for that, or they have to worry about the financial costs of training. And then if they want to, they can come in and do some work experience with us or work around us for a couple of days, bring the children can go and do other things around the museum site, and then we can provide some work experience. And the last thing is just to touch on what Amy was saying, and we are building a new museum this year. We will be open in June. We will, touch wood, please all touch wood. And come and carry wood, come and build with wood. And what this means is we've got a lot of opportunities to build, and there's something very, very empowering, confidence building and competence building around coming in and actually building a structure. So we've already got a date in the diary for the first weekend, but it's also working with other women. So we have a women's cooperative building group from Glasgow who are actually going to come and build a majority of the structures, and they've led on the design, led on the planning and the implementation of this with our architects and with us. So it's all women together working together, and that's a very, very special thing there. But also you're building something lasting that you can come back to, you can bring your children back to, and they also get year-long tickets every year, basically, is what we're going to, I think that was that Jess's idea? Yeah, super idea. Everybody gets a free ticket to come back with your names written on it. So it's long-lasting work. It's long-term partnerships as well. So this is going to go well beyond the Esme Fairbairn. It's also core work. So nice to have has come up quite a few times in his talk today, but it's not that nice to have. It's integral to what we do, and we were doing a lot of it beforehand. So one of Jenny's other roles is she one-to-one works with students from the local school with additional support needs. None of that is funded. It's just part of Jenny's job. She's super duper at it. In fact, Ian has been teaching her Makaton, so she can now Makaton sign, which is very
great to create that space as well for children that aren't able to just integrate with all the other kids in the secondary, local secondary. Nice to offer a space where there's lots of other alternatives. It's really rewarding too.
So yeah, and I think it's a place where the museum is beginning to play a role in the cost of living crisis. So part of the funding was for marketing. We may shift the marketing budget to be marketing, and that get some waterproof coats for the women that are coming that have Cranog logos on. So you'll see it, it's marketing, but it's also warm and waterproof, and we can't assume everybody's got a waterproof coat. So it's that, and it's providing also pathways into work. So you're moving beyond just what we're doing to look at, well, what's Perth Women's Aid doing? What can we do together, and how does that help someone get a job in the future, whether it's with us, whether it's external, wherever else. I've got loads of random notes that I've written and I can't read them. I've just written "I will survive" in red. Yeah. So yeah.
If there's any questions.
Yes, I think so.
Are there any questions?
Does anyone have any questions? Sorry.
You can shout them out if we don't have a microphone.
Yeah. One, please.
Maybe there aren't any questions.
No, maybe there's not.
No. Well, it was worth a try.
It was. One. Oh, we've got a hand up.
I really love your workforce model at the Scottish Cranog Centre in terms of apprenticeships and in terms of really open, and not all organisations do that. Lots of organisations put barriers in place. So I don't know whether any of you can sort of talk or inspire, again, the people at home and in this space about how you can begin to deconstruct those barriers that stop people from participating in the sector, because I love that thousand fingerprints, 1,000 voices. It's really, really powerful.
I think
so yeah,
having a really diverse workforce really, really helps, so that as a visitor coming to the museum, there's always someone that you can connect with or relate to. We're kind of unique in that it's a living museum, so it's really immersive, so you're hands-on, and that seems to really stick with people as well. But having the young apprentices and young people coming in and going, oh goodness, you expect, you have maybe a different expectation of a museum. So it's got a lot more people interested, I think.
Someone mentioned earlier about having different backgrounds within museums, which has also been really good. So I'm obviously museum background, but most of our apprentices aren't interested in that side of things, but then they can go into their own like events and things. They can find their kind of niche and work at that. And that's been really nice in the museum as well. Helps inspire collection work, especially this project too. So
the fact that we're an accredited centre in our own right now means that we've got a lot of control over that. We're just about to start up a new green woodworking apprenticeship as well, which is just about to start. So we've got a lot of leeway we're more in control of what happens, which is really good.
I think it's looking at what the people around you can do. So something I found coming through my sort of education background is you come out very, very much focused on what you're going to do and you as an individual and how you achieve. And actually it's about the person standing next to you and how they're doing and what they're achieving and are they happy and do they need support? And if they're succeeding, then you're succeeding. And that's a totally different model to I think what you get really through university normally. But we see that a lot with the apprentices, they support each other so much. And Jess just pointed out before about the well-being, that we did fiendish plans for some of our apprentices and volunteers about what are your skills and what skills do you want and what is your fiendish plan. If you're being selfish, what do you want to achieve in life? Which for one was just being famous, which is super. I don't know how to do that. But that's something again that we can begin to build in now is looking at, well, everybody's got a fiendish plan, but then how does that work with the person next to you's plan as well? Yeah, cool.
Well, it's good to end on a fiendish plan. So thanks so much to everyone from the Scottish Crannock Centre. That's brilliant. So I do think that's a really fantastic example of the impactful and sort of engaging work that the Esme Fairbairn Collection Fund can support. So do look on our website if you're interested and think you've got a project that can meet the criteria of the fund, because it is a great fund. We've got lots of money to distribute. So that's it. We can now go and have a few drinks. I've just seen them serving the warm wine out there, so that'd be lovely. Thanks very much to Glasgow Life again for hosting. And Tams is mouthing something at me. Yes, yes, I was going to get to that. Yeah, thanks so much for the tech guys in the room doing the tech, which has been brilliant. Thanks so much all of you for coming in person. I'm looking forward to having a drink. And obviously a huge thank you to everyone on Zoom who's also joined us. I hope you had a good experience. So thanks everyone for attending. Thanks.